Hi, everyone. I'm Terralyn. Welcome to Time Out with Tinseltown Mom. I'm here today with a frequent guest, top legal expert and licensed education attorney, Catherine Michael. Catherine represents students and their families in a variety of education and personal injury matters, including special education due process, disciplinary issues, personal injury of children, sexual abuse, school shooting victims, as well as other civil rights and disability claims experienced by students. As the new school year begins, today we're going to talk about how to arm our tweens and teens against bullies. Hi, Catherine. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me on. I love your show, and I think it provides such good information for families.
Thank you so much. And you know, I love having you on. So the feelings are mutual. Yeah. All right. Awesome. So for those who have not heard any of our podcasts before with you, why don't you just share a little bit more insight into who you are and what you do?
So I am an education law attorney, and I work in Indiana, Texas, Michigan, Ohio, and we work in other states through local counsel. But my focus is really on children and their families. And we deal with a lot of different issues. We deal with kids who have been abused in schools, children who are really facing bullying in ways that I think are pretty unconscionable. We deal with teacher abuse cases where a teacher has abused a child within the school system, Title IX cases, school shooting matters. So it really runs the gamut of working with families on their children's interests and making sure that those children are protected. And that goes a little bit further because when children become adults, and some of them are in group homes or other facilities, we will still represent those families and those adult children in those facilities if they've experienced abuse or neglect. So it truly is a disability focused practice.
Okay. All right. You really, your firm does a lot to help kids who are just experiencing these types of unheard of bullying cases. You are doing a great service out there.
Well, I think it's a needed service. And I really, you and I have talked about this in the past, but school has changed dramatically from what those of us who are parents now experienced 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and what our children have to endure in our school systems today. Yeah. Even if they're in a private school, it is still very different. And as a parent, you have to be much more aware of things I think our parents didn't have to face at all.
Yeah. And I also feel like because, we've maybe experienced bullying or we've known people to experience bullying when we were kids, as adults, now you're seeing the ripple effect of mental health issues, emotional issues stemming from those days when they were being bullied. Maybe it was never addressed. Thankfully, today, now we're talking about mental health and how important it is. So this topic, I think, will never get old. I think it's something we need to continue to talk about.
Because it is something so essential. And you just said something that I think is key. We see adults as adults now, right? We might be at a dinner party with some friends. Somebody starts talking about how they were bullied as a kid. It has long-lasting consequences, right? Even in the day and age before we had social media. I was at a party the other night and a woman was talking about during high school, all the mean girls and her experience with that. And it was interesting because this woman is now in her 50s. And she's still going back and talking about these horrible experiences that are 30 years old now, but how it directly impacted her, which is why this topic becomes so essential, because there are things we can do. There are actions we can take for our children, for the children of our friends who are having to go through this right now that can make that really big difference.
Right. Absolutely. So again, today we're talking about arming our kids against bullies. So before we get into the topic on a deeper level, can you just talk about what the levels of bullying are, like the main ones out there?
Yeah. So when we talk about bullying, there are lots of different types, right? There's bullying that we would say is sexual in nature, which would fall under in a school Title IX. That's where a child is being not necessarily sexually harassed, but they could be sexually intimidated. Comments could be made, and it could even get physical in nature. Somebody is walking past them, running their hand across their back. So that's bullying we would call, bullying that is sexual in nature. Then there's going to be bullying that would be that physical or verbal bullying in schools. And most schools have reporting requirements to the state if it's verbal and if it's physical. So physical bullying is what we might typically think of as you're shoving somebody into a locker, you're tripping somebody in the cafeteria. The verbal bullying is you're calling somebody a name. Now, all of this goes to, it needs to be occurring on that repeated basis. So that's where we look at how even states all define bullying slightly differently, but it's when it's on a repeated and ongoing basis. For instance, if I say something to someone today saying, you're being such a jerk, but that's the extent of it, that's not necessarily bullying. It may be a mean comment to somebody who maybe didn't do something. But if on a daily basis, I walk past that individual and make some comment about them, there comes a point, and there's not necessarily what we would call a bright line test, but there comes a point that it does become that ongoing bullying of another person. The type of thing and this is something I think you and I made reference to in another one of your episodes, where it's the type of thing, that if it happened in a workplace, there would be it would be dealt with within 2 days. But because it's happening in a school, we're starting to look the other way. And so that's, as a parent, when a child is saying, they're teasing me, and you're through with week 1, right? This isn't just some kids disagreeing. It's where it's that pervasive, ongoing conduct. And it doesn't have to be simply from one person, right? We often see bullies in groups. Once a child becomes targeted, sometimes they become targeted by a whole group. It becomes almost a form of entertainment. And that's one of the things we typically see in the bigger bullying cases is this is not a dispute between 2 children. It's usually one child who tends to be more of an introverted child, a quiet child, and then a group of other kids who they're looking for somebody to torment or taunt, and this child just happens to be front and center. So then we have, the physical, the verbal, and then we get into the cyberbullying, which we're seeing a big rise of. And again, that's where it starts they're putting things about this kid on Instagram, Snapchat. I had a case recently where they had a slumber party, took a lot of pictures of a girl and sent them to all of her friends and everybody. They put it on Instagram as well. And that is a form of cyberbullying. And so we have all these levels. And the problem now is that we not only have the cyberbullying, right? You have the physical, the verbal, and you have children who are going into the school day after day and having to experience that. The other thing parents have to be on guard against, and this is a very sad fact, but it's a very true one, is sometimes you will get staff members who knows what necessarily happened to them in their childhood, but where they will bully students. I've had cases where coaches have gone beyond the level of, we're saying they're just coaching, they're just trying to, they're yellers, they're providing feedback. It's a little rough, to where they're really saying things to the kids that are very, very inappropriate and which rise to the level of bullying and harassment.
Yeah. See, I want to have you on because I was actually thinking I want to talk about that topic. If a teacher is bullying a child, like, how do you know the signs? So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think sometimes parents don't realize that could actually happen when their child is telling them, oh, Mr. So-and-so is being mean, or Coach so-and-so is yelling. You know what I mean? So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Well, and sometimes what we'll hear from a parent is that they kept discounting it until at some point they actually overheard a conversation with their child and that staff member, and they realized this wasn't a normal way an adult would interact with a child. We've also had cases where a child is telling a parent repeatedly, so-and-so is, rough with kids at school, and the parents tend to discount it to begin with. And then we later find out the situation is pretty horrific, right? Whether they're putting a child in holds that are inappropriate, putting them in seclusion rooms, or even going so far as abuse. And we're seeing more of the abuse cases, in the past year than I've seen in a decade previously. So there's certainly some problems out there. And I think the short staffing is leading to more of them as well.
Yeah. So when we're talking about this topic with our kids, just so we're not, we want to preempt it. So just so we're not like putting fear into them, like, how do you suggest we broach this topic with them to tell them how to arm themselves in the right way?
Yeah, and this goes to self-advocacy, right? Even if your child is in a perfect situation, they've got their group of friends, they have activities outside of school, you're not concerned about it. You want to teach your child about it in a proactive way so that they can advocate for themselves even when they're in college. And you want to teach them how to advocate for themselves in a way that will call attention to a situation that shouldn't exist or to advocate for another child. So the way I approached it with my own children, and that psychologists advise that when we're talking to a child about it, we talk about showing kindness and respect to others always. There are going to be many people that we disagree with, that we don't like, that seem different or off, and that we treat everyone with kindness and respect. And if you see someone who's not doing that, it's really important to let an adult know. That doesn't mean that adult necessarily has to take any action, but to really keep open that dialogue and to encourage them using those words all the time: kindness, respect, dignity, so that they, at least, you're going to be triggering something when they see a kid getting tripped in the cafeteria. They're going to start thinking that just doesn't sound right. And that's where, as a parent, and this is really hard with the tweens and teens, but is getting them to keep open that line of communication with you. And it's really asking open-ended questions. Often, if you give them advice, they may have that stubborn approach of, you don't understand. And so asking things along the lines of, not just how was your day at school, but when I was your age, girls were insane. Are they still as crazy? And then if they start talking about somebody and, someone saying mean to someone else, saying, how did that make you feel? How do you think it made that other kiddo feel? Do you think that there's anything we can do about it? Right. And getting them to brainstorm and provide you information without you necessarily, as a parent, immediately running to write an email to the principal. But by keeping those lines of communication open, you're teaching them to talk to you about it, that it's okay, that it's the safe space, because sometimes parents will fear that, if they go and they send an email immediately, that their child's going to shut down. And in some of the really horrific bullying cases we've had, the child has initially gone to a parent a few times, parent emails the school's like, look, we didn't see it, we don't know what to do about it, so that's it. And what happens is the child gets into a state of what we call learned helplessness, which means they just feel trapped in that situation. And then that is what leads to these really awful cases where either they're starting to use a substance to avoid it, they're skipping school, or the cases where they fall into depression, anxiety, or suicide attempts. So that's really what you have to be on the lookout for, is not inspiring fear in your child, but inspiring the understanding that they themselves need to be treated with respect, kindness, dignity, and that the people that they're dealing with and they see within their school should be treated that same way, and getting them to be vocal about it. Also, that goes along with, if there's a problem at some point, if asking them, what options do you think are going to be available to deal with that? What do you think you can do? Is there anything that I, as your parent, can do? But getting them to start to say, what can I do about it? Because sometimes that what can I do about it is, if they say nothing, that's where you're starting to see that learned helplessness taking seed, and you're really going to have to become more proactive.
Yeah, as the parent, you need to
as the parent.
Yeah. So I think sometimes the situation, as you mentioned, where the teacher or the principal says, oh, we didn't see what happened, and then as a result, the child thinks, oh, well, I told someone and nothing happened, so now I don't want to tell again. So in those situations, you're saying, being an advocate, we need to teach them to be advocates for themselves, and just to continue to speak on if they see something that's wrong, even if that was their experience before. Like, is that what you would recommend?
And it's not only saying something again, but it's as a parent, and you're unfortunately going to have to do this, because most human beings, and this goes for lawyers, I mean, most of us tend to be non-confrontational in nature, right? We want to work things out. And as parents, most parents, okay, there are helicopter parents out there, there are parents that are high maintenance, but most parents are always trying to be friends with their child's school. And so what happens is the parent will send an email to the teacher. Nothing happens. The child is crying. They'll send a letter to the principal. Nothing really happens. They'll sign their child up for some therapy. And, things still aren't getting better because, therapy, while I think it's really phenomenal, and if a child is struggling, they need to be in it. If they're still having to walk into a situation every day where they're being tormented, that's not solving the problem.
Yeah.
And so that's where, as a parent, it's also understanding your legal rights. Most states now have some sort of regulation about what a school has to do when there's been a report of bullying. And that is usually having a meeting with the parents. In some school districts, it's being able to transfer schools. In other states, it's where you can actually get the bully transferred. In some states, it's where the school is actually going to be forced to hold a hearing on some of the bullying. But as a parent, you will really want to start putting pressure on your school if it continues to happen. And you want to do it all in writing. And here's why. I have a case right now. Wonderful parent. Her 11-year-old attempted to commit suicide as a result of long-term bullying. She had repeated meetings with the school. We have many emails, but for instance, she was in a deposition last week and they said, so there are no emails to the school between November through January. So the bullying wasn't happening then, was it? Okay. And she's like, it was happening. I had countless meetings with school staff, but you didn't put anything in writing. It wasn't important enough to put in writing. Okay.
Wow.
And these are the questions a school district is asking a parent whose child attempted to kill themselves, who had multiple emails, meetings. And so that's where I'm saying, as parents, you've got to be on guard, because the one who's looking out for your child, and I can tell you this for more than 20 years of doing this, is actually you. It's not necessarily a school district that tells you we care about all kids, we're here for you. It really is you, and you're going to have to be your child's biggest advocate and teach them how to let you know and how to advocate for themselves, tell adults. But as a parent, you need to be putting all of this in writing. Even if you think, this was a little thing today, Jennifer came home crying and I'm just going to take her to the therapist. Send an email to the teacher and say, we've been talking about bullying for a while. I know my daughter's only 13, but today she came home crying. The situation with the school is just not improving. What options can you provide us? Because my daughter is a victim of bullying at your school. And putting that in writing. And if you have to do it every week, you have to do it every week, but you're creating a paper trail as to the indifference that some parents get from the districts.
Right. So hopefully before it gets to that, going back to, as this new school year starts, are there any practical things that a parent can do or tell their kid to do? Like, let's say the school year hasn't started. It starts next week. And the kid's like, okay, I know there's a bully at the school. Like, what can they do? Like, should they avoid that person? Like, are there any practical things they can do to kind of prevent it? I mean, that might be kind of a naive question, but
no, but that's a great question, right? Because in theory, right, we're looking, how do we prevent things before we start?
Yeah.
And that comes back to the self-advocacy. Even doing a rehearsal with your child and saying, if somebody tries to bully you, and this works really well with the early middle schoolers, if somebody tries to bully you, what does that look like? So they understand what bullying is. So that's my first practical tip. Make sure your child understands what bullying actually is. Right? Is it someone, calling them names? Okay, that in most situations legally is bullying. Is it someone shoving them? Yeah, I mean, if it's accidental on the way to the locker, that's not bullying. If it's someone purposely shoving them. If it's someone posting an inappropriate picture of them on Snapchat, bullying. Making sure, number one, they actually know what it is. Two, that they understand that it's unacceptable and it's illegal. That it is not something they have to tolerate. And that it's not something as a parent you're telling them to, just roll with it, or kids will be kids, or boys will be boys, that they know that is not what's expected of them. And that what's expected of them is simply to let somebody know if somebody is engaged in, we can call it illegal conduct, right? That works well for the preteens because they're looking at it and like, yeah, I'm going to let my mom know so-and-so is doing illegal stuff in the bathroom with, torturing somebody. With your teenagers, again, it is reinforcing, again, that they understand it. And two, how do you deal with a bully? Most of the time, a child who's a bully is a child who already has other issues going on, whether they're struggling in school, they have a bad home environment, they've been subject to abuse themselves. Most of the time, somebody doesn't just arrive in the world fresh-faced with good things happening and just start to torment others. So letting them know too that if somebody's bullying them, that person maybe needs help as well, and that they can be instrumental by letting you know. So if there are people that need help, and making sure your child knows to tell you if they see other kids being bullied. Some of the cases where we've been the most successful at showing school districts had noticed knowledge and need to be putting programs in place is where you find that multiple families have emailed them seeing other students being bullied and saying you need to be stepping in and you have a legal obligation to do so. So that's what becomes really important. And that sort of takes away the fear for your child, because you're not necessarily even talking about them being bullied. You're talking about if you see somebody else being bullied, you too have a responsibility to speak up on their behalf and to let us know.
Yeah. And I think that's really good. I think sometimes kids are afraid to speak up, whether it's themselves, they're getting bullied, or someone else, because they don't want to be looked at as a snitch. Right. So how do we dispel that so they don't think of themselves in that way?
And that is one of the biggest issues with why we talk about getting them to communicate. So there are a few things they can do. One, most schools on their websites now will have anonymous bully reporting forms. If their school doesn't have that, they can actually just take a report to the office, or drop it off at the office before school opens. And most schools are supposed to make these, keep all information regarding bullying and actually report it to their state Department of Education on a yearly basis as to those bullying requirements. So that's number one. If that child really feels like somebody needs to intervene and they don't want someone to know, filing those reports, and then without their name, somebody else could have seen it and reported it. No one knows it's them. The other thing, and this comes to a parent's individual discretion. There are cases where when a parent comes to me and they describe what's going on, and the child is saying to me, I don't want to be a snitch because I don't want it to get worse than it is right now. Mm-hmm. In those cases, you walk that line as a parent of, the situation is so bad, it's not necessarily going to get worse. And if I'm worried that it's going to get worse, that's when you need to be looking at another school. If you're in a place where there are no other schools, that's where, being really assertive and letting the school know that they're actually on the hook here too. This isn't, and this would be a meeting with school administrators. This isn't simply between one child and a group of children. This involves the school corporation, because just like if you worked for AT&T or I'm trying to think of big companies here, or Microsoft. Okay. If I'm going into the office each day and I'm getting shoved into doors on my way there, somebody calls me some really inappropriate names on my way to sit down at my desk, I can sue Microsoft, right? I don't necessarily have to go after the person who even said all this. I can go directly after Microsoft or AT&T. This is the same thing. The school owes a duty to your child, a legal duty. That's why all of these big bullying cases you're hearing about, the $9 million verdicts, the $20 million verdicts, the $5 million verdicts, they're not against the families of the bullies, right? They're against the school corporations because of their legal duty to protect your child. So if your child goes in and they report bullying and things get worse, and that school corporation doesn't either expel those students, move those students to another placement, get those students counseling, or figure out what their needs are, change schedules. I'm a big fan of if there's only one school there, let's just change everybody's schedule so they don't even see each other. Then your school has that liability. And that's what I want parents to remember, is they're not powerless either. They have a lot of power to enforce a lot. And it's just knowing that they have that power and that it is so much better to use that while things are more early on than when they get really problematic.
Right. No, that's really good. Now, would you advise, and again, this is another naive question. Let's say the kid knows that there's a known bully at the school. They're getting ready to start the new school year, and maybe that bully has bullied the victim. Should they proactively do anything? Like maybe go up to the bully and say, oh, let's start the school year off on a good note. You know what I mean? Or should they try to avoid that bully? Like, do you advise anything like that? Or is that just depending on the situation?
That would be, I wish I had a crystal ball and could help that child, right? Because some situations, it is just, if you can avoid the person, this is most bullies are children who are struggling with their own issues. If you can avoid that person, sometimes that frankly works out best. If that child has been bullied in the past, that's where even talking to the school ahead of time and saying, can we make sure that there's no overlap in schedules so that your child isn't coming into contact with them? Because what it tends to be is sort of just like in crime, right? You have motive, but then you have to have opportunity. And if this bully is looking for somebody to go after and your child's not around, then they're unlikely to necessarily, get in their line of vision for bullying. The other thing that I sometimes worry about is I've had parents that try and proactively have their child make friends with the bully. And in some situations it can work, and others what can happen is that it's actually a bullying circle. They all do make friends and they choose another victim. And now their child, trying to avoid being bullied themselves, is now being bullied into bullying other children to stay out of that line of sight. And we have to remember, like any other place in life, there are going to be individuals who have mental illness. There are going to be children who are really not stable, and can be very hurtful and can be dangerous. And that as parents, our main focus needs to be on, is the environment they're walking into safe? When I say school district, most schools are actually, corporations. Is the corporation that is charged in taking our public tax dollars to keep our child safe doing so? And what can we do if that's not happening? And that really is just pulling that school in and saying, you really need to do this, figure out how to make this work.
Yeah. Now, what if a child has been bullied over the summer break by a kid? Maybe it's just mild, but they're getting ready to start the new school year at the same school, the victim and the bully. Should the parents proactively reach out to the school before the school year starts? Like, how should that work?
Yeah, that can be a great option for them, especially if there's the opportunity to put the students in different classes. Sometimes there's not, but even letting the school know, look, there's been a little bit of tension over the summer. We really want things to get off to a good start. What types of programming are you offering that's teaching kids here about social skills, showing kindness to others? What bullying programs do you have in place, so that you're already getting them to think about, oh, these kids are coming in from the summer. What things are we going to put in place to teach about bullying even in the beginning of the school year, and to have sort of a heightened protection and look at this child who's coming saying, I'm already being bullied by this other student. Because schools actually do have some liability for things that happen outside of school when it carries into those school doors. So if a child has been bullied all summer, and then you run into a situation where they are now coming into the school and the parent is putting you on alert as a school corporation that, Jennifer has been bullied by Tommy all summer, let's say, and the school doesn't take some proactive steps to make sure that Jennifer is now safe in their school, that's where it becomes a big problem for the school, because they then have that duty. They're put on alert, right? It's foreseeable that something could happen, and so they need to take those steps.
All right, wonderful. And as we wind down the conversation, is there anything else that you can think of that a parent or a child can do to be proactive in this area, or do we cover it all?
I think it's just feeling like they have the power to speak out. None of this has to be tolerated. Just like you and I wouldn't tolerate people yelling at us, as we walked into our office. I wouldn't tolerate if I went to our office lunchroom and somebody tripped me. And teaching your child that's not to be tolerated, and having them get into the mindset of, I will be treated with dignity and respect, right? And again, there are going to be mishaps here and there. There are going to be, especially with preteens, fights between the girls over things. There may be a boy who feels excluded, but there's a big difference between that and situations in which are really very harmful. But giving your child those skills and saying, here's how you advocate, right? You stand up for yourself, you report it. And you know that you don't have to tolerate this. We will find another option is going to be critical. And then as a parent, knowing that you really do need to be speaking up, sending emails to the school, calling the school, that you have the power in that situation to ask them to enforce that law.
That's excellent. And I think you mentioned it earlier, but I think it's also just instilling in our children how valuable they are. Because I think if they don't realize their value, then they're more likely to let someone talk to them in a way that's degrading or inappropriate. But if they see that, oh, yes, I am valuable. No, this person shouldn't talk to me this way or treat me this way. Then I think that'll also help if they can see that in themselves.
Yes. And really saying no one should ever call you that name. Mm-hmm. That's really inappropriate. And we're going to take action, and here are some options. And that's where you keep coming back. I mean, again, the worst thing you can do as a parent is just tell your child, well, I mean, this is our only option. Just try to ignore them, or just putting them back in the situation again and again and again. That's where the problem happens. It's when that child feels they have no options. And it's often when a parent doesn't feel they have any options. And that's where they're starting to get into their own learned helplessness of, I can't afford a private school. This is our only option. And that parent needs to be at the superintendent's desk saying, you're violating the law and I'm going to call you on it.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. Now, where can people find you if they want to know more about you and what you do?
Well, they can go to our law firm website, which is www.cmklawfirm.com. And I also host a monthly coffee gathering for parents. We talk about all sorts of issues, from starting the school year right. We talk about IEPs, developing IEP goals. We talk about what to do with bullying. There are all sorts of topics, and you can visit that at www, which I don't even know if I need to say anymore, but it's coffeewithcatherine.com, and Catherine is CATHERINE. So it's coffeewithcatherine.com. But we offer many, many free classes, really just to inform parents of their rights and get them really thinking about, what can I do? What power do I have in this situation? Because I think the worst thing any of us can do as parents is sit back and feel powerless. And that we really need to find, ourselves that empowerment to get things done.
Hey moms, thanks for listening today. If you enjoy this show, I would love to hear from you by way of an encouraging review. This podcast is meant to be a blessing to mothers, so I appreciate any support for this platform. Until next time.